Really lovely to see you all and to have been part of what rapidly coming on to being 2 days of provocations about what are the choices that we can make, what are the ones that we should make, and where do we take the creativity that we have into the future, I think with an idea of making some kind of improvement. And I don't think this panel is any different. As Jeff said, the panel is going to explore climate justice and its intersection with arts practice and technology. And our panellists are bringing perspectives today as advocates, as activists, as academics and artists. And each can claim at least 2 of those monikers in their relationship and practice. I might give them some more, and they can argue as to whether or not that title fits. We're going to explore emergent questions and trends across the work of our panellists with a focus on play, embodiment, ways of knowing and technologies that are informing how we approach the realities of climate change with imagination and resilience and respond to the polycrisis in ways that centre ethics and humanity. And for that noble endeavour, we have a full 75 minutes. So I'm thinking that we will have a moderated conversation for about 45 minutes, and then I will throw over to the Slido and engage all of you in this as well. So I'm going to just give a quick background as to who I am, and then I'm going to ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves and to share where they come from, their connection to this topic, but also their connection to country. And by way of orientation, I will begin. I'm the 3rd generation of settlers who came to Australia in the 20th century, on my mother's side as economic migrants from the north of England and Ireland, and on my father's side as political refugees from Europe. I was born in Warrane on Gadigal land and spent my childhood there as well as in Asia, Europe and North America, the latter on Lenape and Wapiga lands. I have a deep affinity for the sandstone and saltwater country of my birth, and for the past 8 years I've called Wurundjeri Wurrung country my home. I express my deep gratitude to First Nations people for the opportunity that my family and I have had to be nurtured and thrive on country, and pay respects to First Nations people and their enduring relationship with country, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. My role today is to moderate. I'm going to hand over to Nell. Do you want to go next?
I can go next.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, nice to be here with you all. My name's Nell Whitley, or Eleanor, but most people call me Nell. I am a partner in a studio called Marshmallow Laser Feast. We were hosted here a couple of years ago for an exhibition called Works of Nature. And it's really nice to be back here on our way to Wellington in New Zealand, where the exhibition's now in Te Papa. I'm British. I'm from quite a long line of British people who were probably Vikings originally. I was born in a place called the Lake District, which is in the northwest of England. I now live in the kind of middle of the north of England in a national park called the Yorkshire Dales. We are sheep, lots of sheep farming, lots of dry stone walls, and the studio that I run is in London, so we have a lot of movement between those two places in the north and south of a very, very small place in considering where I am right now. This is my first trip to Australia, and it's a pleasure to be here and to scratch a very, very thin surface of a deep place and history and culture, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, I'm Tim Shiel. I was born on Wurundjeri land. I've lived here my whole life. I was born in a town called Whittlesea. Shout out Whittlesea. I've been lucky to travel around a little bit, but very blessed to call this continent home. And my base layer is I'm a musician, so I've been releasing and self-managing my own music project for 20-something years. And then as any arts worker, an artist in their 40s, my CV is just a potpourri of glorious, wonderful, strange experiences that I feel very grateful for, including touring the world with a band called Gautier and spending 10 years at the ABC as a radio broadcaster. I also have worked on video games as a composer, but I'm here in my current capacity My day job at the moment is I'm the community organiser for Green Music Australia. Green Music Australia is the national non-for-profit for climate in music. So we help the music sector go green, but we also help drive advocacy through music. Yeah, my role there involves a lot of community organising and talking to artists and liaising with artists, as well as running campaigns, including our No Music on a Dead Planet campaign, which you may or may not have seen, an amazing global campaign that we're happy to be part of. So yeah, really, really excited to be here and be part of this.
Thank you. Jen?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Tanshi, hello everybody. My name's Jen Rae. I have Scottish and Métis heritage from Treaty 6 territory on Turtle Island, otherwise known as Canada. It's from where the Great Lakes meet the Rocky Mountains. I am coming today from Jar country, otherwise known as Castlemaine, known as Upside Down country because it had the largest deposits of gold that were found, and the landscape has been turned upside down. I came as an uninvited guest to these lands in 2008, and I just want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri, the Woiwurrung, and the Boonwurrung people, and recognize that these lands also were unceded. I'm from the Centre for Reworlding and also Creative Climate. I'm an artist, a researcher, a parent, a reworlder, and a joy worker. A lot of our work is about trying to find joy, trying to find ways to deepen collaboration in this time of the permacrisis, but bringing Indigenous and creative methodologies to the fore. And I think being a parent really informs a lot of my work because as a First Nations person, intergenerational justice is very much a part of our core DNA. And Creative Climate, which is also Tim. It's Australia's peak body for art, culture, and climate. And also just shout out to Angharad Wynne-Jones, who's here also from Creative Climate. Yeah, I hand over.
Perfect, yeah. My name is Troy Innocent. I'm fourth generation settlers from basically economic migration from the United Kingdom, and no kind of negative kind of connotations to the United Kingdom, but this was essentially moving from the start of the crisis, of the Industrial Revolution. So I wanted to really kind of situate that. Settled in Dja Dja Wurrung country and Gadigal country, but ended up in Naarm, Melbourne, which is where I grew up on Woiwurrung country, but the last 30 years been living on Boonwurrung country. And so really living close to saltwater, but myself and my practice is grounded very much in the city, and that's very important to the work that I'm doing, and particularly to the lived experience that I bring to that work around and this kind of reality of sovereignty never being ceded means that we're always constantly living in two worlds, which is quite a unique lived experience for anyone living in Naarm, Melbourne, but of course not many people have a way into that experience. So in terms of my creative background, throughout the 90s I was working as an artist and a creative technologist, I guess you would call it now, experimenting with different ways of being or different ways of situating people in affective experiences. And then that was last century. Around the turn of the century, started to realise that the city that we live in is hugely coded and, of course, hugely constructed. So that practice is really about reality and how reality is a social imaginary. And sat with that idea for a while, ended up at RMIT working with urban play, so trying to decode, use methods like reworlding and other ways of decoding that space. And then in 2020, that really shifted. And so this is where founded the Future Play Lab, which then generated a number of projects to bring people into kind of like skills and ways of being and methods for being in polycrisis. And the project that I'll be talking about today that comes out of that is a hugely collaborative project that I'll unpack later, which is the Australian Posthuman Summer Lab. So we'll talk more about that later.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've had the good fortune of speaking to all 4 people individually and also collectively, and we've designed a little bit of a framework for this conversation, but I'm really hoping that they are going to bounce off one another, as well as the provocations that I've developed in talking to them. But the first place I'd like us to start, and this came through so strongly in all of our conversations, was the importance of the work that you're doing around embodiment and ways of knowing. So this kind of, the relationship between environment, art, technology, and the different ways that we can physically and emotionally understand our place in the world. And Troy, I will get you to share a little bit about the Australian Posthuman Summer Lab, which I think I just got the name right, and how it brings together these sort of different ontologies and approaches through the Yalunj-Baring, and what happens when we create this kind of pluriversal, multifaceted way of understanding the world. And I think you have some slides.
Yeah, there's a video that we can run just to show the methods. It's interesting you mentioned the Posthuman Summer School. So this is how this started, around engagement with an Utrecht-based school, which is around posthuman thinking. But we wanted to adapt it, to take it from a school into a lab, so to translate what is a long-standing tradition of posthuman philosophy into tangible methods that can be grounded in place. So you see on screen here how we start this lab. We've run 3 of these. The third lab finished just this week on Tuesday. And it starts with the self-proclaimed radical ancestors, who are Professor Rosie Braidotti, who is a continental philosopher based in Utrecht, has written a trilogy on post-human thinking and philosophy, grounded in ideas like new materialism and pluriversal thinking and sensory ways of being in radical immanence, and all of these kind of really expansive ideas about the post-human condition. Bring that into an Australian context, we start with a conversation between Rosie and Nawi Professor Carolyn Briggs, who is a senior Boonwurrung elder, activist, a design anthropologist. Some people call her the Queen of Melbourne. And she has been doing this work since forever. And if you don't know her story, I would recommend, I can't share her story for her, but please look into the vast kind of legacy and map of country that she holds within herself. That's probably the best way to sum it up. So we bring these 2 amazing women together, myself and Fiona Hillary, who convened the lab, to develop a framework for mapping these really diverse but parallel knowledge systems. That map is called Yalunj-Baring, and this means knowledge paths, and this is the core method of the lab. You can see examples of it in practice here, where we're not we have readings, that some of this knowledge is in books, but we walk through the knowledge. And so because what we found, and what's really important about post-human thinking in an Australian context, is that these are not new ideas. They may be new to Western minds, and of course in kind of Western philosophy and art practices and universities, these ideas are taking off and people are embracing them. But of course, these have been long-standing practices for tens of thousands of years. The idea of embodiment, of connecting knowledge with place, of walking through knowledge, of generating knowledge collectively and holding certain values. This has, of course, been happening in this place and across this entire continent for tens of thousands of years. So to recognise and acknowledge and entangle those systems, this is the framework. And as I'm speaking, I might try to drop in various values or ideas from the Yalunj-Baring system. To give you a little bit of context, we run this lab every year. We make a call for participants It's hosted by RMIT University. It's part of the Planetary Civics Initiative, which is about planetary stewardship, about how we can live well together in a planetary crisis. And we go out into the field essentially for 10 days and live and work and play together to generate knowledge. So rather than, nothing wrong with this format, we do some of that as well, but most of the knowledge is generated in relation to place, and that's really important because it is grounding both the climate crisis and, of course, the complexity that in response to that in experience, in experiential knowledge, in ways of being, in ways of practicing together that tease out what your lens barring is. Because at the start, we didn't really know. It's been a 3-year experiment, and so we're just coming to the end of that now.
Brilliant, thank you. Tim, I'm watching you nod along there, and I'm wondering, I think planetary civics is something that you're doing as well, but in a very different way. And if you could just talk a little bit to that and what sort of embodiment looks like from your perspective.
I think I'm thinking of two things. I mean, watching this video and just seeing these people have this beautiful, as you say, they're exploring this really complicated issue, on country and surrounded by nature. We did a similar thing last year with Green Music Australia, where we took a handful of musicians from around New South Wales, Northern Rivers region, to a town called the Channon, which is not too far from Byron Bay, where there is a guy called Jake Taylor, who's the lead singer of a metal band called In Heart's Wake. They've essentially been releasing concept albums about ecocide and the climate crisis for 10 years. And when he's not touring around the country and around the world screaming that at his fans, he's regenerating a property at the Channon. So we invited a bunch of musicians to just get their hands dirty and do some planting, because he's just planting a lot of native trees and stuff. And these are workshops that he runs himself as well. And yeah, it was just interesting how all those, anything you might want to talk about is going to hit home in a much more meaningful way if you're actually out with your hands dirty doing it. In fact, you might not even need to talk as much. And I guess that's something around that idea of embodying this issue rather than just talking about it. And yeah, I guess the other thing it made me think of just in terms of embodying is music as this site that is really physical for not just the performers, but also punters, or however you want to put it, people who attend music. I've just come from a music festival in Lutruwita, Tasmania, called Party in the Paddock. It's 15,000 people, mostly Tasmanians, coming together to dance and be hedonistic and do all the things that we all may have done at music festivals, some former part of our life. And even though a lot of people aren't there necessarily to think about the big issues in the world, they're trying to escape the issues in their lives and in the world. It's interesting how I think places like music festivals, I've noticed, can actually be sites for transformation, for the very reason that people are leaving behind the rhythms of their life. They're not in their job. They might be with their mates, but they're not with their usual people. They're actually open to new ideas. And so seeing artists like one of the artists over the weekend was Miss Kanina, incredible Tasmanian First Nations artist who is just blowing up, touring around Europe with Amel and the Sniffers. She's completely uncompromising as an activist when she's on stage, and just watching people sway and dance as she sings, and then in between the songs, she's really piercing through people with her thoughts and her experience. Mm-hmm. It's just that really beautiful. I mean, many of us, we're here to talk about art and culture, so we understand this, I guess, many of us, but it was a nice visceral reminder of that connection between activism and ideas and just the physical sensation of live music.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Nell, you also work in that idea of kind of sensation. We've talked about, what is the line between entertainment and embodiment, but I think you certainly, if I think about the commission you did with Q and the Oak Tree, when people encounter your work, there's an intentionality around slowing them down and connecting them with kind of diverse ecosystems and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you both talk, because we describe ourselves as an experiential artist collective, and then we often go, well, what the hell's an experiential artist collective when we talk about it? But I think, I was trying to, how do you segue from what you're saying, which they're so real and so people driven, and we often have screens and things in between, and it can feel kind of crass or kind of jarring. So, but the approach is very much like, okay, so we were trying to, whatever that piece of work might be, it's about experience first. So how do you, it's not necessarily about control, but how do you kind of orchestrate the moment that someone arrives to something, the journey through and the exit, much as any artist, or entertainer might do that. So we're sort of, I think that's kind of what we mean, right? We're not just interested in the thing on the wall or the thing in your ears. It's the volume. So, and the three kind of creative leads of our collective, started with, well, two of the co-founders started with, they were VJs and they were photographers, and they were interested in the volume and working spatially. So it's about lots of those things coming together. And then when you add technology in the mix, it's about volumetric thinking, spatial thinking, multisensory thinking, and kind of how those things kind of come together. Really, because embodied, I think the idea of kinesthetic learning, embodied learning and understanding means that we take away something else, right? Or if you give someone an experience, then they may just take it for what it is in that moment, in that context, but can they come back around to it at another time because of how you might trigger memory or trigger something else with the person? So it's I think we're probably rooted in a very similar thinking, but the manifestation comes. We have our palette. We talk about our palette as being these kind of different tools that we kind of can use. But I want to see this musician. She sounds great.
The best.
Yeah.
Jen, you were looking very thoughtful and contemplative there. Wondering what this looks like from your perspective with the work that you've done with Bilier, but also some of the international work that you're doing around, embodied ways of knowledge versus policy, and how they're all intersecting with one another, and what that looks like or feels like from your perspective.
Yeah, I've just sort of been listening to what everybody's saying and thinking about, just even the word climate, and engaging. It doesn't matter if you're working in a primary school or if you're working in UN conversations. We're all humans. Climate change it evokes things in us that activates our reptilian brains and keeps us in a sort of sense, in a state of survival, whether we're talking individually, organizationally, or in the community. One thing that we say in the Centre for Reworlding that sort of really lands things is that, modernity, colonialism, imperialism, all of these isms, at the core are about severing relationships. And we say that, the climate crisis is an intergenerational colonial permacrisis, meaning that it's going to affect all generations, that it is that severing of relationships, and it's not going away. And what I'm hearing here from the other panel members is, there's joy here. It's about coming together, it's celebratory, and that keeps us out of that survival way of thinking. And how do we do that? Like, how do we do more of that? How do we, without being maladaptive to the current situation that we're in? There's a Melbourne scientist years ago did research on feelings of the apocalypse, like how do people respond in terms of the end of the world, and he said that there were 3 ways in which people innately respond, and he said fundamentalism, and that can be, whether we're talking religion or secular or other ideologies. Nihilism, drink, push it away, not going to deal with it. And activism being the only one that wasn't maladaptive. And I sat with that for a really long time, and it was in our work. And it's only been in these last few years that it's the joy work, right? It's we as artists, we know where the joy is. It's what keeps us going, right? And how do we extend that into other communities so that we're not just on the heavy all the time, but we can actually find the joy. And I learned a lot of this work being in the U.S. during the election, and learning a lot from abolitionists. So your presence and joy in itself is something.
Yeah, with the joy piece, the relational piece. Troy, when we were talking last week, we were also talking about the kind of playing with perspectives and the way that the kind of work that you're doing, but equally that artists and creative workers, Nell, you've also spoken about this. We're changing the timescales at which we're considering the issues in front of us. We're finding that kind of moment of creativity as an opportunity to explore. And Nell, I'm really interested in the way particularly that you at Marshmallow Laserfeast are using kind of research and curiosity not for an outcome necessarily, but for the discovery. So you talked about, and I haven't been able to forget this, and I really want to know the answer actually, do dolphins dream in sonar? And you're looking at that not because you want a perfect answer, but you want to bring that kind of playfulness to thinking about big things and connecting people with them. But you also do a huge amount of research, or you work with researchers, don't you?
Yeah, it's interesting the point on joy as well. We work a lot with or we have done historically with an organisation in the UK in the southwest called the Eden Project, who do these big geodesic domes and create landscapes inside them, and many more things. But one of their early research points was to say apocalyptic messaging doesn't work. People don't return. People don't take away what we want them to about these wonderful places and ecosystems that they're creating, and totally turned that on its head to do wonder or those things. And yeah, that's a big part of what we do too. So the dolphins dream in sonar is one of the kind of questions that we, when we're kind of doing that who are we kind of stuff together, we always come back to these questions. How, what does it feel? What's it like to feel sunlight under my skin? Do dolphins dream in sonar? There's one about what if we'd learned to read books through our nostrils, which I thought I quite like that one. So we sort of come back to these like slightly stupid, playful, yes, questions. But actually, when you really think about it, you're trying to talk about the human condition, who we are, why we do certain things, like how we see the world, how other things and species see the world, and that interconnection between us and the world around us. So as a studio, we'll take the natural world and interdependence and those ideas, which we are coming in from a very kind of Western, like scientific, if you like. We're well read, but I think we're still very kind of our education, and we very much acknowledge that and respect to kind of everything we don't know and yet to learn. And then there's a lot of work there, and there's a load of work around the human condition and us as people and why we behave in certain ways. Research is absolutely part of that. Some of it's very literal or scientific, or multiple things can be true at the same time, right? But some of it's factual in the sense of like how do we think this works literally, and then translating that into an image or into a piece of moving image or whatever that might be. And other times we'll take a kind of more, in a European sense, a folklore kind of, or a kind of those more human stories. It's about, and I think really it's about kind of concocting a world, concocting a kind of an idea of what something is, and exposing and opening. We leave a lot of things we don't finish the circle. We leave a lot of things open, mainly because we're about opening and exposing and kind of sitting with that wonder of like, well, do dolphins dream in sonar? Do dolphins dream? Like all of those questions. We're happy with that. Whether or not that has the impact, maybe it could if we did try to close the circle or we did try to push. I'm not sure, but I think the idea that you leave it open shouldn't detract from how deep you go to try and bring those things to the fore, if that makes sense. So we're definitely playing with that idea of being maybe more explicit about what we think in terms of climate, in terms of what needs to change, or how we. But it's this interplay between where we meet our audience and how provocative we can be with our audiences. We made a whole piece of work about the human condition, about desire, our debt to desire, and how we as humans are it's a story about fried chicken and human behaviour ultimately, but it pushes the buttons of people in ways that the beautiful oak trees that talk about interrelationships of and how many species the oak tree holds, and it's beautiful. And then you bring this kind of story about fried chicken and why we've created a kind of brands to sell ourselves these things. and they just reach people in very different ways. So I'm going off topic a bit, but they're both very well researched. But they kind of bringing these different stories. One is beautiful and allows people to access it and kind of fall into that place of comfort around the research, and the other makes us feel really uncomfortable. Some people feel uncomfortable, some people laugh, it's an interesting journey.
And it's something you're exploring, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a sort of a little bit related to that idea of kind of how much do you reveal or connect people with the ethics behind the work? How much can people stand at any one time? Which I think is a really interesting kind of moment. And I remember when we were talking, you said, "Well, we're not really activists," and I was like, "Yes, you are," but in a very different way. And I think there's, you are able to bring things to large audiences and connect them to experiences that perhaps, other ways of connecting cannot. And I'm looking at you, nodding your head again, Tim. What were you thinking there?
Oh, just enjoying.
Just enjoy it. Excellent.
Wait,
Great.
say something profound, quick.
No, we don't need to be profound. Thank you. Jen, you, we've touched on this a little bit, but you've brought sort of cultural methodologies to global platforms, and we've talked about kind of culture having a seat at the table at the very, very highest levels of climate negotiation. When we were talking, you were very cautious to talk about the need for ethics and applying ethics to how culture is seen and what role it is given or can take. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that experience.
Like in terms of how culture has become a thing.
How it's become a thing, and also how I suppose recognising that as a thing, it has to be treated with certain kinds of respect in order to be enabled.
Yeah. So just a bit of context here. I've spent 20-something years trying to advocate for the role of culture and the arts in climate conversations, and that's been from trying to raise awareness, instrumentalizing creative practice, to raise awareness about climate things. It's gone through this whole arc, and it's only been in the last few years that on the global agenda, and that's thanks to some brilliant work that's been happening by artists and arts organizations, predominantly in the EU, to get culture on the agenda. And in Belém, it was the first time that culture was put at the heart of climate action, and now we're really looking at how do we implement that. So that's, we were hoping COP was going to be here in Adelaide, but that's a lot of the conversations right now is how do we do that? But there are a lot of interested parties, a lot of players, and, so you're seeing cultural language circulating, but in that sort of global sense, but we're seeing that the relational accountability is thinning at the same time. So you can hear a lot of the language, but it's not necessarily artists that are up there, and it's not necessarily knowledge keepers that have their legs at the table. It's still seen as quite peripheral. And, I'm hoping that in the next few years we're going to see legs at the table, or new tables, or on the floor, or cushions, or beanbags, or something like that. Because, ultimately, I was in Belém, and I kept going over to different rooms because I was there as an observer. I wanted to see what was going on. I didn't really have a statement, and I just felt like standing on a chair at some point and going, is anybody having any fun in here? Come on, guys. It's, 98% humidity and 30-something degrees, and I'm sure that suit is killing you. Can we, and that was the beautiful thing about the platform on disasters and displacement, is that they brought me in to mix up their form. Right, and to run one of the only side event at this UN gathering. And it would have been great if they brought me in a year and a half before, right, rather than sort of scrambling at the end. But there's an appetite. But I think our language has to catch up. I think that climate change is going to affect all of us in all different ways. And as creative practitioners, it's going to impact the ways in which we tour, we show, we move, we do residencies and so forth. And I think there's a real critical need for us to consider how we adapt our practices and really show our worth in deep long transdisciplinary collaborations. So it's a right moment, but it's also, it's risky for us. But what risks are we going to take? And we can only do this by being in dialogue with humility, you know, an intergenerational perspective. So whatever we're doing, we might not see the impact of, but we might be laying the groundwork for creative practitioners into the future, or, you know, for for humanity, you know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Tim, when we were talking, you were talking about, you know, green music sort of doing two different things. One is the kind of sustainability piece. How do we act more sustainably as a sector and industry practitioners? And the other one was hearts and minds. Do you want to just talk a little bit about those two things? Because I think there's a thing around the moment and risk. And you were talking about, you know, the sustainability piece is kind of there. It's the hearts and minds that's the bit that we need to do now, and I'm just wondering how that intersects with what you were just saying, Jen.
Yeah, I mean, this may be obvious to most people in the room, but, you know, it's like we are living in the climate crisis, extreme weather and climate migration and geopolitical unrest. It's like, it's now, like it's not a thing that's about to happen. But at the same time, we do have to prepare for it to get worse in many ways. So there is, I think, in the climate movement a bit of a Sisyphean task of doing everything at once. Like we really do have to do all of it at once, quicker, and do it with joy. Because, but it's true though. You know, Jen's extremely on the money with that. In terms of the two, a risk of getting a bit too dry. So yeah, Green Music Australia, we've been going since 2013. I'm pretty new. I've been there for about 12 months, but getting to know the organisation, you can broadly divide our activities into these two camps. And these may even, this way of thinking about it may help you with some of the institutions and organisations that you're part of. On the one hand, you have sustainable practice. It's the nuts and bolts. It's how are you dividing your waste? How are you powering your activity? Who's your energy provider? What transport are you using? Like we all as individuals and as families and households and businesses and institutions, we want to make better choices there. It's often really hard to do so. Our organisation for music, for the music sector, we try and do as much of the work as we can to make it easier for people to make better choices. And we run programs and resources, and we've got PDFs out the wazoo, right, is what I'm trying to say. And it's not just music, like different art forms, different industries all have charities like us doing the work, getting a patchwork of funding from different places. What's unique about culture and art and music, in our case, is that music is a vessel for the message, or for solidarity, or for joy. This makes music and culture broadly a little bit different to other quote-unquote industries. Some would say culture is not an industry.
We've all read Justin O'Connor.
That's right, thank you. As the Minister for Creative Industries here, I'd love to say good day for you. He's probably not. What am I getting at? So what was the question? I mean, that's...
I can just jump in.
Yeah, please do.
Go for it.
Oh, no, you're doing really well.
Because there's a real segue here around these different knowledge systems and ways of being. So I introduced Yulenge burrowing in the academic context. There's this philosophical framework, but then when we start to talk about play and joy, it becomes much more free-flowing. And of course you have these two different knowledge systems, or multiple knowledge systems, all coexisting, which is hugely complex. And that's why people go towards really kind of easy answers or simple answers, or go to AI to try and solve it, because holding multiple worlds in your head at once is just impossible unless you're in that open kind of what we call, you know, epistemic openness. You're open to multiple worlds. You're open to multiple ways of thinking. And so this is what often happens in the lab, and it comes back into this other Woonwurrung word, Chinabi, which is about resilience and resistance and celebration. But at the same time, you know, as Donna Haraway would say, staying with the trouble. So you're kind of in these two states at once. because and then in the post-human framework, it's affirmative ethics, which so I'm throwing all of the states all out at once now, because you can be dystopian and despair and the world's over and there's one apocalypse and it's all over, or you can be kind of like super utopian and say there's going to be some technology that's going to save us, and this is the transhuman position that is being pushed on us from tech giants and so forth. But in between is, I think, what we're all talking about is this affirmative ethics of just going, we're all in this together, but we're not one and the same. This is what Rosie would say. But then she would also say, well, the time for imagination is over. So you kind of go, but just talking about what's possible is over. You've got to be doing it. So you've got to be in an imaginative way of being, so being playful. And, so this is the work we do with urban play in the city, for example, is opening up the city, decoding all its scripts and saying this is just a huge construct, it's just a huge system. How can we play with it? How can we hack it, decode it, reimagine it? But be in it at the same time. So it's imagination and action at the same time. Speculation, imagine, action, all kind of cycling together. And this is where Naui comes in and says, this is what we've been doing forever, because it's not like there's one world or that the world is fixed. It's always in motion. And so this is not really, so a lot of people are experiencing this way of being for the first time, but there are ways to be in that chaos and for it to be a positive or affirmative experience. Not necessarily positive, but affirmative. You can be with it.
I think our work is, we're not really futurist or speculative, but I like how you talk about, I really respond to how you talk about the lab and what it does. I think we like to ground our work in now and not speculation in order to be able for it to feel like it's saying something about what is, even though everyone's going to look at that slightly differently based on the fact that, we're not one and the same, that notion. But there is something about being a small independent studio trying to, and we work as a collective because we're just a bit stronger and a bit more resilient that way than it being too big or too small as an individual, if you see what I mean. But it's really hard to, Jen, in terms of that risk that you were talking about, that we do have to think, how do we tour? How do we create projects and so that they can replicate or they can have an impact? I think there's a massive opportunity for us in the sense that we can work globally, but I'm constantly asking the question of how do we as a studio take those or start to rethink how we collaborate with people in order to go, right, here's the blueprint of how to do it. How do I get the resources back to our studio to be able to keep doing it? There's a sort of, because we're not funded in ways, like we have no subsidy. I mean, we're really lucky and we've hustled and we remain, I like working like that. I'm happy to be in that mode. But there's just to sort of draw together, because I was interested about what you said, like it's just really hard to hustle and to keep surviving and to keep being alive, and you default back to that place of going, I won't address that challenge, I won't address that risk, I'll stay safe, I'll do this in order to just basically be making the work. But I think anyway, so we're often asking, do we have the resilience to take that risk, to rethink the collaboration that way, to sort of bootstrap by doing this, to be able to take that risk over here. I think it's a lived reality. So we want to make work which is of now, but we're sort of addressing that way to remain sustained, if you see what I mean. But all the time,
the risk thing is actually a currency. Like it's something that we actually can bring to a highly risk averse world, right?
Yeah.
So, just also context. I was a part of a project called Refuge that was with the city of Melbourne. It was held at Arts House, where we rehearsed climate-related disasters, and we had a methodology called Playing in the Dark, right? And it was acknowledging that we've never done this before, right? Where you're bringing emergency services, Indigenous knowledge keepers, artists, and communities together to rehearse a disaster. And through that work, what we realized, there's a lot of collective IP in that project, so I don't want to claim it myself. But we realized that in the climate space, like all of these institutions that we were working with in emergency services, they were navigating risk, right, constantly. And we as artists were navigating risk
Yeah.
differently. But it was in the speculative space that we could play together, right? And they started to see how we were engaging new audiences that they could never get to the emergency drills, right? And we were seeing how in the speculative space we could take audiences into spaces that they would otherwise be fearful of, right? So risk is something, and even, gosh, the UN and so forth, they're so risk averse of like where your chairs are, and like make sure you say the right person's name, Mr. So-and-so, delegate of the, there's all these rigid rules, and there's no room for risk or movement.
Yeah.
Right? And people are just repeating themselves just to stay safe.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's such a value for us, but we don't want to scare them all at once. Right. We've got to do this gently. We've got to bring them into experiences. We've got to really work relationally.
And the artist has to be able to be resilient in that space, right? So sustained, and to be able to go, I can do this again, or it can be a job, right? It can be something that allows me to keep doing it. Because I think it's that, like, where's the personal risk and where's the organisational risk? Like we funded culture in very different ways historically. So people could be really audacious, really provocative, really put themselves. We don't do that anymore. Not in Europe anyway. Well, not in the UK. Maybe not here so much either. So do you see what? It's just who holds the personal tension? Because you can do it in an institutional way, I think, very differently to how you can do it as an individual in that speculative space.
Yeah. And it makes me think of something, Tim, that you said when we were speaking, which was you were talking to the AFL and about climate.
Oh, yeah, footy for climate.
Footy for climate. And I was going, oh, that was amazing. They must be able to do all sorts of things. And you said, no, quite the opposite. They looked at you and went, you can take these risks because you're the arts.
Yeah, I think we spoke just after I'd had a Zoom call with Lex Lynch, who's the CEO of Footy for Climate, which similar to us, is just a really small group of people. They're trying to activate AFL and AFLW players as well as community level footballers to be advocates and speak up. And they had just run their first ever climate footy player retreat. They would have had a better name for it than that, but where they took a bunch of footy players out to some beautiful spot and gave them some sort of training and trained them up a bit to potentially step into advocacy. And we were just talking about, I was sharing that we've worked with hundreds or more artists around Australia with our organisation, and it runs all the way down from mainstream artists that are in mum and dad's CD collection all the way through to really radical hardcore activists, and they all, we don't really have one set way of supporting them all because they're all approaching things really differently. Jimmy Barnes has to talk to his audience and wants to talk to his audience in a really different way to, say, Miss Canino, who I mentioned before, and that's fine as long as it's authentic and we can help them figure out what that messaging is going to look like or whatever. But I was sort of articulating that to Lex, and he was like, I was basically saying to him that even some real radical musos, we're a bit too mainstream for them because what they're thinking about is a bit further than maybe where the majority of our messaging is sitting, and so we'll be like, great, we support you, off you go. He was saying, like, that he could never get away with any of that stuff necessarily with the footy players, because even though they might personally feel like they feel strongly about things, they're putting a lot more at risk if they speak out. For example, I don't think this is talking out of turn. So Fremantle Dockers, one of their major sponsors is Woodside, which is a massive mining company in WA, which engages in quite a lot of arts washing, I guess, in terms of sponsoring a lot of arts and culture and sport in WA. They're not alone in doing that across the country. And yeah, it's a clause in their contract or something, like it is in all AFL players' contracts, that you can't say a bad word about your sponsors, right? So there are players in the Freo Dockers who are very passionate about social issues. They're very passionate about climate, and they've got hot takes about mining companies. And it's interesting talking to Footy for Climate, again, talking a little bit out of turn, but them being able to sort of help the players find a way to craft a message or say something that's going to land, that's going to be appropriate to the people who are following them. There's kind of no one-size-fits-all to sharing these messages and sharing these stories and trying to influence people. It's really about meeting people where they're at, and for me it kind of goes back to that idea of you sort of have to do everything everywhere at once. There's no right right way of doing it. You have to, as you say, often bring people in gently.
Yeah.
For others, you do have to be out there protesting with them, picketing with them. You know, it's there's a broad spectrum of how to engage, and to do it all authentically is part of the challenge for a team like us.
Jen, you had some slides. I don't know if it's worth sharing them or if the moment has passed.
Yeah,
I don't want to miss the
I don't know. It had
opportunity more than
to do
anything
with
else. We've gone quite off-piste when it came to the script.
Yeah. I've got notes all over the place. Can I just say something just in response to it?
Of course.
Canadians really like Saturday Night Live, right? 50 years of Saturday Night Live. And I was on a plane, I think I was going to Doha, and they had the documentary sort of show on Saturday Night Live, and there's this moment, so it's 50 years that it's been running, which is pretty phenomenal, and there's this moment that they're talking about that Saturday Night Live almost didn't make it to air, and Lorne Michaels is in the elevator with the TV producers and so forth, and they're, it's seconds out before it's going on air, and they thought it was just a really weird show, lots of weird actors, they didn't know what was going on, it was mayhem on the set. And Lorne Michaels stopped at everyone and said, we can't expect people to recognize something they've never seen before, right? And I think even Mark Carney just, in his speech said, we need to take the signs out of the windows. Like, we've never had to deal with all of this stuff that's happening right now. And I think taking that pressure off, saying, what is my piece? What is my role, right? In the food sovereignty movement, I am the seed saver. You are the waterer, you are the grower, you are the harvester, right? Knowing how we plug and play with others, right? And that we've never done this before. It just takes the pressure off, right? Like, let's see, we've got a common objective. We need to be collaborating more. We need to be sharing resources, and we need to fail and critique, not to tear down, but actually to build better, right? Like, we learn that in art school, those are things that we can share with those that we collaborate with, and take the pressure off them, and emergent.
We learn that in art school.
Yeah, because if we're talking about methods, and this, because you were talking before about being in a kind of like panic or survival state, and a lot of the projects that we do, not only through the Posthuman Summer Lab, but connected to sharing and testing the methods that are generated through these frameworks. Work with young people who are kind of experiencing a lot of climate anxiety. So what kind of methods and platforms break out of that? So last year we ran some urban live action role play. So essentially it's bringing together all of these situations. What could happen when Melbourne becomes a megacity, 2050? And so we closed a street for 2 days and played out that scenario. And did these types of role play, participation, disrupted both the kind of state of inertia, of kind of like this deficit of imagination that happens when you're in a state of crisis or anxiety, and opened up the possibilities. And then so the way that kind of works in a circular or reciprocal way is that it creates these core memories of the future, because you're then imagining multiple pathways, multiple ways forward, multiple possibilities. Again, this idea of holding multiplicity rather than just going, I've got to have certainty, I've got to have a solution. Like you're saying, maybe there isn't a solution. There's multiple solutions, and everyone maybe has their own thing to bring.
Yeah, and I think that I'm just looking at the questions here from the floor, and there's a couple that I think want us to do some heavy lifting that we can't do around whether or not we should be engaging with AI given the energy demands, and I think that's sort of a long and big question, and not one that we are going to necessarily intersect with in any kind of meaningful way. But one of the things that is the sort of second half of somebody's question here, which is how do you know you're having an impact? And I wonder what that looks like for everybody. And again, coming off the back of what you've just said, Troy, is that we're all going to do this, and Jen as well, we're all going to do this differently. So you know, how do we measure ourselves? What does success look like? And what do the things we've talked about in this conversation, like, you know, joy and embodiment and connection and relationality, give us as ways of understanding impact? And I'm kind of curious to hear from you what success looks like.
Because, like we said before, we don't necessarily measure it, but there's the really basic cultural ones, which are feedback and, you know, sampling people's response in various ways. We have one small anecdotes where we have exhibitions about sequoia trees, and we did it, had it on in London once, and then the kind of traffic to the Sequoia National Park's website and donations went up. And someone from the organisation got in touch with us going, "What have you been doing? Because we've suddenly got all this money." I mean, it's not a lot of money, but it was very anecdotal, but little things like that. So if we realise if we signpost, or if we talk about things, then we can have these kind of very small ripples that hopefully add to bigger ones. But we probably don't do enough of that as a small organisation as we could.
I don't know that it's about the quantity. It's just a fact of knowing and a way of beginning to understand your own progress, not necessarily, was what I was getting at. Tim?
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, numbers is
metrics.
One thing. Yeah, I mean, but I'm not really a numbers person. I can only really speak on this personally, maybe less than on behalf of my organisation. But, you know, I think it really is the one-to-one conversation, the one-to-one relationship. Like if I feel like something that I've said or some resource I've given someone access to has visibly shifted their thinking or has given them a moment of like, oh, wow, thank you. I mean, we had part of what I was doing at this music festival over the weekend was just talking to punters. We had a volunteer stall set up where all these great volunteers from around Lutruwita had come to help us talk to the attendees about climate. Some of them didn't really want to talk about it because they just wanted to enjoy the music, but many of them did, and you could just see that we were giving them space to process something, trying to meet them where they were at, and then have a warm moment, and then they would move on with their life, hopefully for the better, hopefully just gently nudged towards being more engaged and doing a lot of the things that we're all hinting at here on the panel.
Yeah.
That's at the end of the day, that's the only way I personally feel like I can measure it. It's like how many people am I potentially able to reach, and who do they reach? This idea of I really like this idea of the human signpost. It was this I heard a philosopher talk about it in a podcast years back, and it was this idea that like we're all examples for all the other people in our lives. It seems really obvious, but I think when I feel like I'm being that and then encouraging other people to be that too, then I have put a lot of faith in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, Jen.
This might be a good point.
I was just wondering.
Do I just hit my button or?
Jen, slides, please.
Yeah. We were asked to create a database of people that were working in art, climate, and culture. And at the time, I just thought, we don't need another database. They're hierarchical, they're fixed, right? And in Western forms of knowledge, it's who gets to hold the knowledge and what knowledge gets hold. That's what's prioritized. But from an Indigenous way of thinking, it's actually about the context and the relationship between, and that's very hard to quantify, to assess. And so we started using open source software to really think about how could we use that. But then we also saw a lot of the problems with data. And so we asked this question: what if there was a way to connect all the different people working at the intersections of culture, art, and climate and social justice, so that we can do this deeper, longer work and bypass some of the barriers that prevent us from doing it? And so Centre for Reworlding and Play Reactive, we did a beta version. I've got the slide thing. Okay. I didn't mention earlier, Claire Coleman is the author, is also part of the Centre for Reworlding, and lent us the word bilia, which comes from the word billy. River and belly button are the cores of those words, and so that's the meaning of bilia. You can access this, and I put some cards up there. There's the website that tells about the project, and then there's the network itself. But what's really important about this is that when we did labs and we spoke to people, did consultations, the biggest thing is we need to stop reinventing the wheel and we need to stop duplicating effort, right? So what's the point of least resistance to get to people to find out what they're doing? And so we did people projects and organizations. ICIP means that you get to control your data and how it's used. You can come out of it, you can come in at any time. How you do the tagging and so forth is up to you. And then projects. This is really quite significant because we can start to look for, okay, I'm looking for an Indigenous artist working in ARM who's doing speculative futuring, right? Sound artist, and that you can go, Tim, Nell, can you connect me because I'm doing this, right? And so but also to give that evidence base of practice. This is, we built it with a lot of different people in mind, academics who are writing about these forms of practice. They can actually get to the artists and bypass ethics because they can collaborate with the artists. There's, all the people who never get seen in the work, the producers, the backstage people, their IP can be attributed, and so forth. This gives you a little bit of an idea of how the search functions work. And, it was a project that was a lot of little bits and pieces. If we were a corporate entity, we would have built it quite quickly and quite differently, but the beautiful thing about it is that we're able to change the scope. We can modify things as we go. It's only relevant if users find it relevant, and we can change things and modify things that will be important to people in terms of analytics. So I might just leave it there, but you can take a peek. And also, we're funded to do engagement. So if you are an organization and want to do a Bilia workshop with us, we do it like a Bilia-thon. So we can sit down and we can do all of your archiving and look at all the different projects that you've done. But also, how does it work in terms of the things that you do in the future. So you can map your relationships, which is really quite significant for developing programming, to show funding bodies, to create partnerships, and so forth. And it doesn't, if you're a cluster, you don't have to, attach to the whole map. We might have multiple clusters. The data just keeps telling us different things. So,
yeah.
Just leave it at that.
We haven't talked that much about technology, which was in the title. And what did you want to say,
I was just going to quickly kind of like speak to impact, but also the AI aspect, which is maybe a good segue to technology. Because through the Australian Posthuman Summer Lab, we've had something like over 100 participants go through that, and the call to action at the end of each lab is also to then translate those methods into actions. So if every person that in that collective shares their methods again with another 100 people, you quickly expand, and this is kind of like the relationality that we're talking about. But then there's the other platforms for translating this, and we're creating a posthuman atlas, which will essentially be a shareable version of the Yulenge-Barring framework that then has examples of methods. So things that you can do in your either creative practice or daily life, or in your institutions that have been generated out of these intensives, because it's incredibly time consuming and a lot of energy that goes into like a 10-day intensive. Not everyone can do that. So knowledge translation becomes really critical. And that's where I wanted to make this really kind of like quite lateral connection back to the AI question, because using AI is really resource intensive, but one of the things in posthuman thinking is that tapping into what's called potentia, the human potential, which is what happens when you kind of have this open-ended kind of connection with the world. There's massive processing power in people, but that's shut off most of the time. So being posthuman means opening up your entire sensory apparatus and your kind of full cognitive capacity as a human. And then, like you're saying, if you relate that with other humans, suddenly there's this complete other kind of knowledge system that's running in a completely different way to AI. And it's really hard to do, but it's worth doing.
And I think only possible if you have that kind of embodied sense of what you know.
Yeah.
And so much of what I think we're experiencing at the moment is mechanisms that are distracting us from actually what we can know ourselves. So being centred in what we can know and that embodied kind of sense of knowledge and then that relationality is actually an incredibly radical act. Because it's removing yourself from those extractive kind of processes and putting yourself into deep relation. The impact might feel much smaller because it doesn't scale the way technology might scale it. But if you start to think about it as depth and you start to think about it as duration and you start to think of it as, using those sort of frameworks that Jen, you were talking about, the intergenerational, this is a long-term stewardship piece. And I think that answers, some of the questions here about, how do you make sure you're not worsening the crisis? It's like there's a thing about knowing that you're not in relationship to that crisis in a way that's panicked, but actually in knowing that you're in that relationship with some kind of sense of joy and possibility, which actually feels like a really important indicator for something that is good practice or success. We've got 6 minutes and 50 seconds according to the horrible clock. And lots of questions coming in again. But one of the things that I would like us all just to quickly reflect on as we finish, which is a question here: what does joy look, feel and sound like to you? And the second part of it is, how does inserting more joy into our work and life help us hold on to what's slipping away? And I'm just each of you responding to that as we close, I think would be a nice way of wrapping this up. So what does joy look and feel like and sound like, and what is it helping you? I suppose I'm going to say hold rather than hold on to. Small question.
Better do it.
Yeah.
Do you want me to start with technology then?
Yeah, go for it.
Because it comes off what I was just saying is that there's so much human capacity, and it is connected to joy, and your only way into that is through play, because you open yourself up. So you have to let go and say, I'm just going to experiment, like for what if, that's what joy is about, right? So we know about play is this, it's learning for children. They don't think it's learning, but it's hugely generative. So if you want to kind of like reframe your capacity to engage, you'll reframe your capacity to regenerate yourself, but also regenerate the world, then going back into that playful way of being is super critical. But as adults, there's a really important difference, because there's also this other cycle and around criticality. So you can be critical and speculative and joyful all at once. So this is this openness that creates possibility. And this is what we do. So with local government, with museums, with galleries, with communities, with neighbourhoods, a lot of the work that we're doing it's always grounded in place, and it's always about the first invitation into urban play. This has been the research question since forever, is how you invite people into that speculative space. Not in an other world, but in the actual world, in the lived experience of your daily life, because that's where it gets difficult. But that's where it also becomes really fun, because it's disruptive, and it defamiliarizes the everyday. So suddenly something that might seem routine or immovable, like a city that's only been here for what is it, just less than 200 years. Suddenly there's other possibilities, other futures. And coming back to the technology really quickly, we have to recognize that technologies aren't just things like this that I've been looking at to keep my brain engaged and grounded in this expansive conversation. But things like language and wayfinding and being with place and being grounded in place, these are all technologies that are pre-digital, but we're now seeing them through a post-digital lens, so that we can kind of reimagine them and reactivate this human capacity, which is also joyful.
Great. That's a pretty hard one to follow up on. Would anyone like to try?
Oh,
Nell, big sigh.
It's the what it makes you keep hold of that I'm struggling with. I mean, joy is all the things that I think it's collectivity, isn't it? It's the things we do together. It's the I don't know, I guess it's the intergenerational thing of showing the inside of a tree, right? And even if it's relatively simple, it's that discovery. So I think joy is discovery. It's new perspective, constant learning, in order to have new levelers. As in, like, oh, we all kind of saw that same image. We all understood it from a different perspective, but it gives us something. So there's something about what we do, the joyful side of what we do. It's making people laugh. I think it's very simple. What's it slipping away? It's we're so, like, the hype cycles of technology are so anxiety inducing, right? And they're and for good reason. So I want that to slip away. We were talking yesterday about film, 100 years, this year, something like that. The notion of filmmaking and the wealth, the kind of celebrity, the kind of hype cycles of culture of what have surrounded that. It's kind of interesting to take a moment and go, wow, it's been 100 years since we started making moving images or in that way. So I don't know. I kind of want to let go of some of those. We've not engaged in quite a lot of those hype cycles. Yeah. I think AI is a thing that we can't ignore from anywhere. It's not great, but it's also, the possibilities are huge. And I think I hope we can find a way to joyfully engage some of those things. I don't know. Sorry, that's a mess.
I didn't think so. Tim?
Yeah. I think if you are panicking, or if you're really worried, or you're grieving, or you're outraged, you should be. Yeah. I think joy is.
Yes,
we can talk about this,
but we're not dismissing the reality.
Yeah, we're not dismissing that. You should be. You should be really outraged and want to do something about it. I interviewed a guy from the UK once. He's part of a dance duo called Joy Anonymous. That's the name of their project, and I tried not to ask artists, like, where did the name come from? But, I wanted to ask him what joy meant to him. And he told me that he'd redefined it, not as just happiness, something as kind of basic as that, that for him joy was like fully embracing the whole range of human emotion, which I guess includes all those things, the anger and the rage and the sadness and the grief, and that he was trying to live a life where he was embracing all of that. And I guess in that context, music, art, culture helps us process all of those feelings. It helps us understand perspectives. It helps us learn emotionally and in other ways from each other. And that's why, supporting culture and giving artists a seat at the table and creating new tables is, I think, a base layer for climate action. So, if you're working on art and culture in the coming decades as we continue to adapt to the climate crisis, you are a climate activist. You just might not realise it yet. You are at the base layer of what we need to make change happen.
Do you have time? Yeah. A scarcity mindset. If Indigenous people around the world bought into that, we'd be extinct. We come from a point of abundance. We're not saving anything. Look at how many resources. Look at all the things and the people. Look at it's a reframe in thinking. Our brains cannot occupy gratitude and anxiety in our brain at the exact same time, right? So if we start with gratitude, right, we are automatically in an abundance mindset. And what does that joy feel like? It's tender. It's coming together. It's embodied. In fact, when you even ask that question, I had this feeling in my body of my child being held by this beautiful person in my community. That was the first flash. It's what we need more of, right? That human and technology can do so much, and it's an incredible tool. But we're amazing. Our trees are amazing. There's all this other amazing things, and it's how do we stay in relation with all of these binaries? Just don't benefit anybody. So.
Binaries just don't benefit anybody. I think that's a perfect place to finish. Thank you all so much. I've got what an amazing and inspiring session. Thank you here. I don't think I need to say more, but I will ask everybody to join me in thanking our panel.